Once you've marked that songbook, let's think about a little bit about what is in Matthew chapter 5. This chapter that was our scripture reading this morning is absolutely an action-packed chapter. And I don't have time to open all of this content up in the time frame that we have set aside for our study this morning. But what I do want to do is hit a few high points. This chapter, Jesus is not teaching anything new in this chapter. Everything that Jesus talks about has been taught before, and what Jesus is merely doing is unpacking the intent behind the teaching. So you'll notice a lot of things Jesus says are not necessarily new. And I looked at this chapter last week when Dennis read chapter 4, and I thought, I've got to talk about chapter 5. And typically, I would be drawn toward the salt and light aspect of this chapter. But I really, where do you begin? There's the salt and the light. There's Christ coming to fulfill the law. There's lust. There's Jesus' doctrine on divorce and remarriage. There's all of this stuff. But I think if we look at this chapter and condense it down into and I'm going to focus on anger today. But if we condense it down into the purest form, and where I want to go with our anger lesson today is it really can be found in the very last paragraph, where Jesus says in verse 43, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemies." This was a prominent teaching under Old Testament law. It was a misunderstanding of what God had written. And Jesus says, "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." If we were to sum up Matthew chapter 5 in as few words as possible, we would probably say it boils down to a heart and soul issue. Everything in here in Matthew chapter 5, in this section of the Sermon on the Mount, boils down to a heart and soul issue. And it's no different with the anger issue that Jesus addresses in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21 through 26. And I'm going to reread that just to put it fresh in our minds. Again, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old." So again, this is nothing new. This is something that has been taught from old. But here's the way God's commandment was taught. He says, "You shall not murder. Whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you," so Jesus is saying, okay, that's what you've been taught. He says, "I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother," there's a footnote in our English Standard Versions. If you're reading from the King James Version, some of the Greek manuscripts that the King James translators followed will say without a cause in there. And that is in some Greek manuscripts. But it does not appear in most Greek manuscripts. So the English Standard Version just says anyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults or hurls a detestable verbal abuse, whoever insults his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, "You fool," will be liable to hellfire. So, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar, and go first, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. And the Greek word there for penny is a Greek denaries, which is about a 1/64th of a day's wage, a 1/64th of a Greek denarii. So basically the equivalent of our penny is good. It's the smallest form of Greek change, if my understanding is correct. So, anger results in a poor or strained relationship with God. Remember, my attitude, the attitude that I have that emanates from my innermost being, from my heart, or we might say our soul. My attitude does not just affect me. Okay? So anyone with someone who is struggling with an attitude issue, I'm looking in certain directions. Anyone who's struggling with an attitude issue, it affects everyone around you. It affects your friends. It affects your family. It affects the church. And it will even affect your relationship with God. Now that's every attitude, whether it's a good attitude or a bad attitude. Anger is an attitude. It is a feeling. And oftentimes we look at someone who is angry and we see the physical effects of that. But oftentimes we forget the internal effects of anger, which is what Jesus is actually teaching about. You've probably heard, and maybe even you've used it. I know I have. You've heard the expression, "It's the thought that counts." That really goes with anger and our attitude. But this saying actually originated here in Matthew chapter 5, down in verse 27 and 28, is where this saying originated from. Jesus is teaching on lust. And he says, "You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery." He says, "But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So, what Jesus is saying is, if you think it, you've already committed the sin. Okay, let's back this up. Let's apply it to anger. If we think it, we're already angry inside. We don't have to wait for it to boil out. We don't have to wait for it to come out in this explosion of what I would refer to as wrath. Anger is relatively small, and it begins inside as an emotion. So Jesus says, "You've heard it said of those of old, you shall not murder." What is Jesus comparing this to? What I want you to entertain is that Jesus, just like he's comparing lust to adultery, sexual immorality, he's comparing murder and anger. I want you to think about that. It's what goes on inside our thought process that leads to an end result. There are some very physical, obvious downsides to anger. And I worked for a number of people over the years. Over the course of my life, I guess I've been in the workforce for, I hate to admit it, in public work for over 22 years. And I've worked for some great people in those 22 years. But in that 22 years, I've also experienced a lot of anger. And so I've observed, just as Solomon observed in Proverbs chapter 14, there are a lot of downsides to anger. Proverbs chapter 14 in verse 17, Solomon says, "A man of quick temper acts foolish, and a man of evil devices is hated. Anger, when it is allowed free rein. I used to joke that, okay, it's not a joke. Okay, serious note. But I used to tell this story in kind of a joking fashion. One of the first houses that I was actually in charge of as a foreman, we were building from the foundation up. And it's a little house that's out 26 on Goose Run. Jeff and Brenda Sparks, wonderful people. Brenda used to bring us donuts every morning for breakfast. And she'd bring those in and give them to all the guys. Well, we got up to the roof line, and we were doing the roof, and I had very limited experience with shingles. And the two boys who were working underneath of me had even less experience with shingles. And so what happened was we were working on the roof, and we ended up with a sag in our shingle line. And so my boss came up, and he drove up the road, and I saw the truck stop. And I thought, oh no, here we go again. The truck stopped right there in the middle of the road, and I could see him stick his head out of the window and look at the roof. And he comes up, and the first thing I saw was not my boss, but rather a flying speed square. And it was flying right at me. He's like, what in the world are you thinking? Don't you know what a chalk line's for? It's to keep those shingles straight. Okay. I thought that was what the little line on the back of the shingles was for, that you put them up to. And, I thought that's what that line was for. But anyway, obviously it didn't work. We had to tear 3 rows of shingles off. And, to this day, I can go out to that house. It's due for a new roof, by the way. I went out and looked at putting a new roof on it and repair some shingles that have blown off. So it has been 22 years ago. 22 years ago. And there's still a line on that roof. And you can see it, not because of where we tore the shingles off at, but there's a line on the roof where we ran out of shingles and had to get another bundle of shingles they looked right at the time, but 22 years later, they don't match. It was a different batch, a different run of shingles, and there's a line on that roof. Anyway, but the one who acts rashly, the one who becomes angry quickly, Solomon says, acts foolishly. He says, a man of quick temper acts foolishly. And so that is something that we need to take into. That's a very obvious physical attribute. Drop down to verse 29. Solomon says, whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. Again, just those little quips from Solomon that illustrate the very physical drawbacks of anger. And since that begins deep inside of us, it would do us well to learn to kind of control our emotions deep inside before they begin to spill out. And I'm gonna pick on Vernon for a little bit. There are some times, Vernon, where you have a temper and I'll hear someone wail. And I'll say, what happened? They'll say, Vernon hit me. And I'll say, Vernon, why did you hit her? Because I lost my temper. Okay. So my son needs anger management classes. Hence, I decided this was the perfect topic. But it's not just Vernon. It's everyone who needs anger management classes. If we go back to Paul's letter to the Galatian Christians, Galatians chapter 5 and verse 19. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 19, the Apostle Paul says, flip a page to get to 19. Galatians 5, verse 19, Paul says, now the works of the flesh are evident. And he gives us a list. I want you to notice this list. He says sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, and strife. He says jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envies, drunkenness, orgies, and things. Now I want you to notice in the middle of this, he says strife. Okay? Strife is where there's tension. Strife is a work of the flesh. I want you to notice strife if it's left unchecked. Strife, we're going to say that strife is the seed. Strife is the seed within our heart. And when it's allowed to sprout, it becomes into jealousy. And jealousy, if left unchecked, grows into anger. And anger grows and produces fruit of rivalries and dissensions and divisions. All of those things, it just kind of compiles. I don't think the Holy Spirit inspired the Apostle Paul to write Galatians chapter 5 in this order by accident. This is something that grows. You know, it's one of those things, a lot of times I've observed this in myself, and I've observed it in my children. And quite frankly, I've observed it in my wife. That there is, particularly when she's pregnant like she is right now, but there's a point where you can take so much. I can take so much. And I kind of have learned as I've gotten older where that level is. But you know, when I was a teenager, I didn't know where that level was. I was still learning where that level of tolerance was at. And so when I was learning where that level of tolerance was at, suddenly I would reach a point, I would just explode. So as an adult, as I've tried to put the teachings of Jesus into practice in my life, I've kind of learned where that Paul says that strife is. And what I try to do is I try to get the Roundup out and spray that seed before it even sprouts. I want to kill it. I want to kill it right there where there's strife. You know, one of the things I did when I was a teenager and became, you know, where it just, when I was trying to learn to cope with anger, instead of exploding on one of my siblings, I was the oldest of 8 kids. It's not easy being the oldest of 8 kids, is it, Ruth? Oh, if looks could kill, I'd be dead. I think I got frostbite from that one. But seriously, it's not easiest being the oldest and having those responsibilities. And so what I would do is, as I was trying to gauge my own reactions to the environment, is I felt the strife beginning to well and swell, and it's sprouting, and you know, I know that it's going to produce anger. As that anger began to crack open like an overripe melon, I would go outside and I'd find glass to break. It didn't matter if it was pop bottles. I loved mirrors. You know, my dad had quite a collection of junk, and so I would just start. I would pick up a rock and I would throw it at a glass bottle or a window pane, not in the house. You know, this was in the junk pile, and it would release some of that tension that was building up. Because it was building up inside of me and it was going to come out, left unchecked. And so I found a way to deal with that.